Before we get started, I just want to extend a big thank you to our Changemaker partner, the Open Society Foundations, for supporting today's event. So what are we going to be talking about? We're about 2.5 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, and while in high-income countries like here in the UK, about 3/4 of people have had at least one dose of vaccine, and they're already rolling out booster shots of vaccines specifically targeting the Omicron variant. Meanwhile, in low-income countries, only about 1/4 of people have had at least one dose of vaccine. And other interventions, diagnostics, and potentially life-saving treatments like Paxlovid are still widely unavailable. So I probably don't need to spend too much time making the case to everybody gathered here that there have been big problems with equity in the global response to the current pandemic, which need to be fixed before the next pandemic rolls around. But at the same time, the international community is facing an estimated annual funding gap of about $10.5 billion for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. So how are we going to fix these problems? Where's the money going to come from? What are the big challenges going to be? And how do we make sure that equity and equality are at the heart of these global efforts moving forward? Those are some of the big questions we're going to be tackling today. We're going to start with a conversation with Mark Malloch-Brown, who I'm sure needs no introduction to most of you. He's the president of the Open Society Foundations. We'll follow that with a panel discussion with some real experts in this area, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So it would be brilliant to hear from as many of you as possible. If you do have any questions that come up during the discussion, note them down, and we'll get to them at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague Richard Jones, Editorial Director of Devex, and Mark Malloch-Brown.
Thanks, Jess, and good morning.
Thanks.
Online around the world. I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Malloch-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Richard.
It's certainly been an eventful 3 years since we were last in person here in London at this Devex Future of Development Finance Summit. We were talking backstage about the effects of COVID still being keenly felt in many parts of the world, Putin's war in Ukraine pushing up food and fuel prices, not to mention all of the comings and goings here in London over the past few weeks. Now we're seeing 0.7% of GNI commitments falling away, aid budgets tightening. How optimistic or perhaps pessimistic are you, Mark, about the international community being able to kind of reset, redouble efforts, come together to close the estimated $10.5 billion funding gap that Jess has just mentioned, particularly as it relates to global pandemic preparedness and response?
Well, Richard, I mean, it's only one of a number of, pending calls on the international purse, if you like. I mean, there's a conference going on in Germany as we speak on Ukraine reconstruction with a staggering $350 billion bill for reconstruction. And surprised to find it's again funded, as it happens, by, or sponsored again by OSF. We seem to be everywhere. But, the issue really is with that kind of call, with the sucking sound of monies leaving general development priorities and getting reallocated towards Ukraine, including its refugee asylum costs in Europe and elsewhere. It's a very bad moment for development finance, including for the $10.5 billion. And we've both got to restore the political will and make people recognize that these problems are shared problems. We are an island, but we're not really an island. And we have to recover that message and sense of will and momentum around development finance. And then beyond that, we've got to look at new tools of development finance, more innovative tools which don't depend entirely just on taxpayer generosity, but have an element of leverage in them and of private finance in them, which will mean that we can raise more and go further.
Just last week, global health leaders gathered in Berlin for the World Health Summit. And there was one group, the People's Vaccine Alliance, who warned that the pharmaceutical industry is really trying to assert more influence going forward on the world's response to future pandemics. So as we consider pandemic preparedness and response capacities in particular, what should we be particularly mindful of in terms of ensuring health equity and health access, particularly as it relates to life-saving vaccines?
Yeah, well, I mean, OSF is in its core a human rights organization, and we came, into this space because of the sheer injustice of the sort of inequality of equity and inequity of vaccine distribution rather than directly on the health agenda. And and I worry a lot at Big Pharma extending its grip on the framework of long-term pandemic preparedness. I mean, Big Pharma has a role. I mean, the innovation of the mRNA vaccines, the speed at which it was done and taken to market is a real tribute, and we should not suppress that kind of entrepreneurism, that sort of capitalism at its best, if you like. But it must be set within a regulatory framework which deals with issues of access and pricing and universal availability. And that needs strong regulation. Left to these companies alone, we can already guess the kind of price point these drugs will be available for, the distribution strategies of who gets them first. We cannot repeat the injustice of COVID, which not only had a huge public health cost, but a massive political cost that we're still living with. It has fueled a whole new level of intensity of distrust of the global north in developing countries.
Perhaps we could turn to the Open Society Foundations and your support for mobilizing up to $1 billion, as I understand it, from multilateral development banks, domestic financing for vaccines through COVAX. You're also planning to engage with some top donors in the new financial intermediary fund for pandemic preparedness. This has been established by the World Bank. What puts OSF in such a unique position to really encourage other donors to put their money on the table, and what commitments do you hope you'll see?
Well, thanks, Richard. I mean, look, I think foundations generally, because a lot of what you've described we're doing in some cases in partnership with Gates, in some cases with other foundations, and one of the key things we're doing is with Michael Anderson of MedAccess, who's here in the room, which was a guarantee to allow accelerated COVID purchases before countries had sort of transferred the resource to buy it, so that we could get the doses out faster. And that's the kind of financial innovation that Michael and Gavi had come up with, that we were glad to join. But I think all of us foundations, have this sort of opportunity of being much nimbler, much faster, much greater risk takers than organizations funded by public monies. I don't mind having to go tell my founder donor, George Soros, we got this one wrong, George. We lost the investment, because he himself comes from a background of high risk investment. I think he'd be upset if too many of them went awry, but the whole point really is take risks and go places and try to demonstrate to public investors that we've de-risked a space that they can then go in by having piloted it and showed it works. So, for example, we're doing test and treat pilots in 8 countries at the moment with a group of the Clinton Global Health Initiative, University of North Carolina, and some others, because we saw a public donor wariness about would test and treat work in Africa, which for an old Africanist like me who's seen HIV, Ebola, test and treat was sort of invented in Africa. And so, I just want to show my exasperation to these traditional donors. And again, I have the privilege of being able to do that. But what I can't do, even though, I'm lucky enough to be president of, after Gates, probably the second largest private foundation in the world, what I can't do is match the resources of the public donors. We're no substitute. We can be innovators, but we're spending $1.5 billion a year this year. Gates a lot more, but it's a drop in the ocean when you tell me $10.5 billion for pandemic preparedness, $350 billion for repairing Ukraine, and $1 trillion for others. But just perhaps one last example. We, Rockefeller and Gates, have set up a fund to push for the reform of the multilateral banks to lift their lending levels. And it was a big news 2 weeks ago at the meetings in Washington of the annual meetings of the World Bank, IMF, because it was seen as a sort of ginger group fund to push a set of G20 recommendations about increased capital by the capital adequacy provisions at the World Bank, etc. So again, we're innovators, but we need followers. And at the moment I look over my shoulder and there's no DFID, it's disappeared without a trace. There's not really a British Foreign Office as far as one can tell. And the World Bank is out there, still the biggest funder in, say, the climate finance space, but at half the level we need it to be to tackle, say, the climate financing issue.
Another issue that I hope we'll unpack in the panel ahead is how we can get better at engaging local civil society voices, whether it's through funding or whether it's through innovative engagement mechanisms. So I'm talking about things like the design, the planning, the implementation of these efforts. What role do you think OSF and other donors play in ensuring that civil society, particularly from low and middle income countries, really have a seat at the table from the outset?
Well, in a sense, it's part of our DNA to invest in civil society. Our sort of founding philosophy, in a sense, was, you need to have as many voices at the table as possible to get as close to the truth as possible. There's no monopolies of wisdom or truth or anything, and that, therefore, the cacophonous debate is critical to good public policy, and in many parts of the world. I was just in Africa last week. We're still investing heavily in civil society because we see it as a balance against pretty bad government in many countries there still, and deteriorating government. So it is key. But I think we've also, what I always caution my colleagues is to also be realistic. You also have to be advocating where the power is. So there is still a very strong role for northern advocacy groups in Brussels, in Washington, in Berlin, even in London just about. And so it's a balance. We need both the southern voice around framing priorities, shaping approaches, but they need northern partners to take that message to what, rightly or wrongly, are still too many centers of power located in the global north. So, it's a matter of balance. You need to support civil society at both ends. And the other point of balance, which has made me a slightly controversial inside OSF, is my belief that in order to represent the powerless, which we consider our mission, you have to sometimes go sup with the powerful. So it's not enough just to support civil society. We have to engage with government in very real ways to get the policy reforms we want, and be very pragmatic and never let the perfect be the enemy of the possible as you push for these important goals.
Perhaps, Mark, a final call to action. What do you hope our audience here today in London, watching online around the world, what can they take away with them in terms of practical, actionable steps that they can apply in their own work and their own decision making?
Well, I think each of these issues is one step by step. And we don't get some vast new allocation of global resources which can do the pandemic response, can do climate, can do general development. Each of these needs their own advocates, and if we push all those different rocks up the hill, when we get to the top we can look down and we can say we've transformed the development finance space. But we've just got to, each of you I'm sure online and in this room, has your own single issue. Don't be ashamed of that, because success in development finance is pushing all those single issues forward. It would be great if we had a sort of global political establishment with the vision to sort of say, let's take 2% of GDP, a couple of $1 trillion, and let's collectively fix these problems. That's not, sadly, how it's going to happen. It's going to happen stone by stone, so go carry your stone.
A pragmatic note to end the interview today, Mark, but thanks so much. Thanks for helping us to really eloquently
pleasure.
set the scene here today in London. And it's a big pleasure to now hand back to my colleague Jessica Abrahams, Devex Pro Editor, who will lead us into our next panel. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark and Richard, for that fascinating conversation. It's a great way to kick off the discussion today. I'm going to be joined on stage now by a brilliant panel of speakers who bring a lot of expertise in this area, but sort of from slightly different perspectives. So we're going to try and tackle this issue from all of those perspectives now. Just a reminder as well that we will have the Q&A session at the end, so do keep that in mind. Thank you. And we'll have one speaker dialing in as well, so that's what the television screen is doing there. Precious Matsoso is dialing in from South Africa. But I think the rest of the panel can join me now. Brilliant, thank you so much. It's brilliant to have you all here. We're going to be building on some of the issues that were raised in that conversation. But before we get started, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves briefly. So maybe we can start with you, Colin.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Colin Puzo-Smith with Results. We're a grassroots anti-poverty advocacy organization based in the U.S. and also appreciated the comments we just heard about Global Partnership. We're the U.S. arm of Action, which is a north-south international partnership of civil society focused on health equity.
FIFA.
Hi, everyone. I'm FIFA Rahman. I'm civil society representative for the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator attached to Health Poverty Action here in London. And I also run a global health consultancy firm called Matahari Global Solutions.
Peter.
Hi everyone, my name is Pete Baker. I'm Assistant Director of the Health Programme at the Centre for Global Development, and we're a think tank based in DC and in London.
And Precious, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Brilliant, thank you for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, my name is Precious Matsoso from South Africa. I'm the former Director General of Health, and I'm currently with the University of the Witwatersrand, and also the co-chair of the INB.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. It's brilliant to have you here. Colin, I'm going to start with you. When we talk about funding for inclusive and equitable pandemic preparedness, what are the sort of key elements that we're looking for? And if you're able to address this in just a few minutes, what went wrong this time that we might be able to improve on next time?
Sure. So I want to start by naming that I think too often pandemic preparedness can be a sort of ugly code word for protecting people in places like London and Washington from the next future threat. And I think what we fund and how we fund now will determine if we accept that or if we reject that. And you have this preparedness agenda, but in the meantime, this week or last week now, the WHO had to start rationing cholera vaccines because there isn't enough supply for the number of global outbreaks going on. Or you look at the Ebola crisis in Uganda right now, and to say nothing of a disease like tuberculosis, which is still the biggest infectious killer behind COVID and a pandemic, I might add. But the good news in that is that I think it's a false choice between stopping the pandemics of today and stopping the pandemics of the future. Because the same strong health delivery services can do both if we resource them to do it. And to take tuberculosis as an example, PCR testing, ventilation, contact tracing, masking, these are like relatively new terms to the average person in Washington, where I live, since 2020. But TB healthcare workers around the world have been experts in these things for years. And so when COVID came along, we saw TB programs, clinics, testing machines repurposed for COVID, and rightly so. But the problem was that those programs were already largely underfunded, which meant your best case for responding to a new threat was a system that was already fragile. And so, yes, we certainly need better global monitoring and stockpiling, but I think our top priority has to be building out primary health services that reach people today, and in the process are building systems for the future. And that's the what in my view, but I think just as important is how we fund it when it comes to equity. And because if we like magically got a check tomorrow for the $10.5 billion and used it primarily to support country-level health systems, if we spend it through a neo-colonial model, we're not actually going to meet the need in the world. But if we can get the funding to community-led, accountable, transparent local systems, then I think the impact could be transformational. And I realize that governance and funding modalities are not the most glamorous, but they are so important when it comes to equity. First at a global level, who decides where and how funding flows? We heard a little bit about the new financial intermediary fund earlier, and I know we'll talk about it some more here, but after a very rough start in this regard on global governance, they've actually made a lot of real progress, so I want to give credit where credit's due on that. But just as important is governance at a country level. Is this funding projectized? Are funding decisions just essentially a handshake between a finance minister and a development bank? Or do you have health workers, civil society, communities at the table and with authority at that table? And same thing for those same groups, are they involved in the actual delivery, the monitoring, the oversight of programs? Because without them, you are never going to reach the communities that have been the most marginalized, that are facing poverty, that are isolated, that are criminalized. I know we were hoping to be able to hear from a representative from the FIF today, and I think there'll be a video that we share online later. They've talked about values of equity and inclusivity, which I really, really appreciate. But I don't think they have yet proven that they're ready to give those values real teeth in their operations. They have a group of implementing entities that are sort of predetermined to be possibilities for channeling funding to countries. But many of them are really not up to the task when it comes to equitable funding for health systems. They're lacking transparency and trust, don't have a viable model for community ownership, not a good track record on pandemic preparedness. So we have to make sure that the funding flows through the institutions that are well suited to this. And there are some. For me, it points straight to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria as a potential platform for this. It's not a perfect institution by any stretch, but it is far and away the most equitable governance structure and best track record of any institution that's on that list right now. And for other areas that the FIF is looking to fund beyond health systems, like technical assistance, I think the same thing applies. If you're gonna fund technical assistance, are you gonna pay a bunch of people like me to swoop into a country as a consultant? Or are you gonna pay for locally rooted expertise like the Africa CDC or others? And I realize this might all feel a little bit premature in terms of details when the FIF hasn't yet decided where it's gonna focus its funding energy, but how you administer this money is not an afterthought. And I think if we can reject the false choice between the new and old pandemics, if we can make sure that the bulk of our funding goes to community-led systems, and if we can do it in an equitable way, then I think there's real opportunity.
Thank you, Colin. That's such a great overview that touches on pretty much everything that we want to dig into deeper now with the other panelists, so that's great to hear. And one of those issues, of course, is the question of access, because alongside the question of money comes the question of access, who gets access to what, when, and who gets a voice in deciding that. So FIFA, you're really our sort of in-house expert here on the ACT Accelerator, which was the key initiative that was established at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic to get access to COVID-19 tools for lower and middle income countries. What have we learned from that initiative, and what can we do better next time?
Thank you so much for the question. It's a pleasure to be here, and lovely to see you, Precious, even if it's not in person. I hope it happens soon. There were so many lessons coming out of the ACT Accelerator that need to inform future pandemic response. There is an independent evaluation report that I suggest everyone take a quick browse of. But the first one I really want to talk about is the Health Systems and Response Connector, which was really ignored, and vaccines really sucked the air out of discussions about any other technologies or even the Health Systems and Response Connector. Now, in 2020, when the ACT Accelerator came about, the Health Systems and Response Connector was presiding in several working groups occurring over 2020 and 2021. And in 2020, we made a big deal about the fact that it was only covering oxygen and PPE. Oxygen is arguably more of a therapeutic, and health systems is so much wider than those two things. So we were just like, look, we need to see some investment in community health workers here, because, these people know their communities. They're going to be able to reach into their communities to bring elderly people to vaccination centers, mobile populations, undocumented people, whatever it is. And they were like, our job is to address the acute stage of the pandemic and not to strengthen health systems. And, we were really concerned about this. And of course, in 2022, they started saying, oh crap, nobody's uptaking these tools. And you're like, well, we told you in 2020 that you needed to invest in community health workers, and that was not listened to. So it did become an I told you so moment, and this didn't apply just to vaccines, because there was a lack of uptake of diagnostics, and today we have a lack of uptake of Paxlovid, although there's obviously supply restraints as well on those things. But ultimately, part of this is a story of CSO engagement, and I said this last week in Berlin at the World Health Summit, that throughout the ACT Accelerator working, we found it certainly easier to work with organizations that were more familiar with civil society, like the Global Fund, like Unitate, like FIND, while others were more reluctant. And behind the scenes, there were so many times when we had bilateral calls with agencies to play a bad cop, good cop role in public meetings where we needed to push something through. There are so many examples on this. Community health workers is one, but self-tests is another, because there were a lot of what I call PCR fundamentalists who were preventing the WHO guidelines on self-tests to come out. And LMICs were waiting for those guidelines to roll out their self-tests. So all of us who live in the global north had self-tests in our homes. But while LMICs were waiting for these guidelines, there were people who were going like, well, but people won't know how to link to treatment. And I'm like, who are you talking about here? People won't know how to link to treatment. And it was us in Global Fund and Gates, actually, and FIND that pushed the agenda forward on self-tests. And this is another lesson. Countries need to be able to rely on their own scientific data and regional scientific data and stringent regulatory authorities to make quick decisions in the pandemic response space. The WHO has a massive burden on its shoulders, and it's heavily underfunded. So this is definitely something important. But I want to talk about Global North priorities. If we're gatekeeping access to self-tests, I want to talk about the fifth in this regard, because one of the priorities that has come out quite clearly and quite centrally in the fifth is the issue of surveillance. And I was speaking to folks last week at the World Health Summit, and they were like, it's a banker's agenda, right? You want to strengthen surveillance across the Global South so that you can get notifications early and you can prepare the economic response. And while surveillance is really, really important, there are so many other elements of the health system that are really more of a priority for the Global South. And we heard this in the Biden Health Summit as well, where the Global South was saying one thing, and then the Global North was all surveillance, right? So I think we really need to center priorities and think about who are we really doing this for. We've also had to work with development banks through the pandemic, and I've made lifelong friends in these agencies. But some were shocked at the fact that, civil society, you guys have PhDs, wow. And it really it gave me kind of a shock. They weren't familiar at all with civil society, and it's not just about PhDs, right? It's about the expertise that comes that comes from countries that goes, okay, in my country you need a priest to endorse vaccinations, or else nobody's going to get vaccinated, or community health workers are more trusted than clinicians, so in my country you're going to need community health workers to go to houses and provide self-tests. So that doesn't come from a PhD, that comes from community expertise. So I think we really need to examine the understanding of what expertise is. Finally, I didn't want to start with vaccines because everybody else does, usually. But it's evident that rich countries will continue to hoard doses in future pandemics. This should be just taken as a fact, and the space between pandemics is shrinking. So manufacturing capabilities, increased R&D in the global south, technology transfer agreements, and a new TRIPS order is what we need. That's the only way we're going to find our way out of the next calamity. So thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Fifa. And both, in fact, all three of our speakers so far have touched on the so-called FIF, the Financial Intermediary Fund for Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response, a bit of a mouthful, affectionately known as the FIF. The FIF, this is the sort of key new initiative that is being proposed now to attempt to fill this $10.5 billion funding gap. It's housed at the World Bank. So let's try and dig into this a bit more and how it might be able to tackle some of these issues. Peter, I know CGD's been involved in sort of doing a lot of work around this, so I'd love to hear from you what we know so far about the FIF, because I think it's fair to say it's still very much a work in progress. For you, what are the big challenges going to be, and what are your recommendations for it, particularly from this sort of equity perspective?
Great, thank you, and thank you for the chance to speak here today. Indeed, CGD were very excited when the FIF was launched. We were involved in the G20 high-level independent panel that made the recommendations for something like this and outlined some of the kind of challenges and opportunities with it. I think for a long time, I'm sure you guys were, many of us have been saying that pandemic preparedness was an underfunded area, and although it was never urgent, it always felt like it needed to be tackled. And of course now, to all of our costs, we've gone through the COVID pandemic, and it's very exciting, I think, now that we've got, for the first time, an initiative which is really focused on pandemic preparedness. For those who don't know, it's currently aiming for $10 billion a year portfolio. It's housed at the World Bank. It's a kind of trust fund where a range of traditional and non-traditional donors can contribute. It has a secretariat managed with World Bank staff, but then it has a technical advisory panel of international experts chaired by the WHO, and a board made up, my understanding, the current proposal is 9 9 major contributors or donors sitting on that board, 9 what are called co-investors, which is a nice framing, I think, because it shows that actually the major determinant of pandemic preparedness is countries investing their own funds in pandemic preparedness. So what previously might be called recipient countries or something like that is actually now called co-investors. It's the idea that the FIF is only sort of topping up or contributing in addition to domestic resources. And then I believe there's currently a proposal for 2 CSO civil society representatives as well. So that's the kind of governance structure. Unfortunately, only about 1.4 billion, I think, is currently being raised. So whilst that's progress, and the first range of proposals are expected later, or the first request for proposals is expected later this year, and it's clearly far below the required 10 billion. So the first challenge, I think it's quite obvious on the surface of it, is where is the FIF going to get this money from? Like we've just heard from Mark and others, there's most countries in the world are not growing, most aid budgets are not growing. There's so many demands on aid budgets. The UK is not even committing to the global fund right now. Like, where is the contributions going to come from? The second big challenge, I think, is that the FIF has a wide range of priorities right now, and it's not clear what the main priorities are, or how it's going to even develop a criteria to make that decision. Is it going to choose, how is it going to choose between countries? How is it going to choose between projects? How is it going to weigh up efficiency versus equity? Is it going to consider gender? Is it going to, all these issues are not currently decided. So that, I think, as that's worked through, both the criteria setting and also the measurement of progress, like there's no sort of targets, there's no agreed way of knowing whether we're moving towards a situation with better pandemic preparedness. As that develops, we will begin to make progress, but the second major challenge I think that comes from that is who gets to make the decision. I think this has been raised by both panelists. Like, is this governance structure appropriate? Do we think that having 9 donors and 9 co-investors is the right balance? Or is what's likely to happen, is money going to begin to talk, and the equal balance will be shifted by the fact that the 9 are actually coming to the table with a large number of resources, and they'll begin to get what they want. The reason why that's so important, I think, in pandemic preparedness, which has been hinted by the other panel members, is that pandemic preparedness is hugely beneficial to high-income countries as well as low-income countries. And so there's a very strong incentive within the fifth and within any pandemic preparedness initiative for donors pushed by domestic interests to shift priorities towards their own. So the governance process around this is absolutely critical and needs to be sorted out from the beginning. The third question is around, and it links very closely to this, is around additionality. The idea of the fund is supposed to be that it's purely additional to existing global health initiatives. And I hope many of you have been around now in global health for long enough to be a bit suspicious as soon as that kind of thing is said, because, well, where is additional money going to come from? We've just said there is no obvious source of expanding global health money. Now, you could say, well, actually there are, because this is a national security issue for every country. So perhaps this could come from national security budgets or Department of Health budgets. So it could theoretically be additional. But the temptation, I think, for most countries to see this as a way of contributing aid money to an initiative that has substantial gains for their own country is going to be very great. And my understanding is actually the 1.4 billion is actually ODA, I think. Others may correct me on that. But already we're seeing them move away from that promise of additionality, which means then you start to get trade-offs. You have to think about trade-offs between pandemic preparedness and wider health system strengthening goals, which then comes back round to the problem of who decides. Like, is it a priority to invest in community health workers to hand out bed nets, or is it a priority to invest in surveillance to detect the next respiratory infection that's going to go all around the world, affect low-income countries and high-income countries equally? And who gets to decide that? My final point is that in the end, pandemic preparedness is a domestic issue. It will be solved when domestic financing and domestic policymakers decide that this is a priority. So all these initiatives, the fifth, so on, they are very important, but they will only work if all countries want this to happen and they want to invest it themselves. It won't happen because the fifth incentivizes it to happen. It will happen because the country. So therefore, the fifth needs to start turning its perspective a little bit on its head. It needs to start from country health system strengthening. It needs to start from what has both benefits in terms of health system strengthening and pandemic preparedness, and how can we support countries to take that step by step and build that up. Not kind of what is these global priorities and then how do we pick projects and invest in them. That will work project by project, but in the long term that will not build, I think, the global system that we want. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think that was a fantastic overview, and I think there's a few key themes that are really coming out now, including this issue of having to take a holistic approach, not being able to separate pandemic preparedness from global health system strengthening more broadly, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about that in a bit. The other one that's coming out is this question of governance, and I think, Colin, you mentioned as well the idea of teeth, and how do we give teeth to these projects, these initiatives that are supposed to be guaranteeing equitable access and equitable funding for pandemic preparedness, which is a brilliant way to come on to Precious, who has been working on this potential pandemic treaty at the WHO, which is supposed to strengthen the governance of the global pandemic response next time around. So, Precious, I'd love to hear from you about how your work on the IPPPR feeds into all of these issues, ties into the question of the fifth, and also the governance of funding structures more broadly.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by saying that, this has been a pandemic of inequities and a pandemic of inequalities. And it is going to need a global collective action and solidarity And people will say, yes, of course, we've had solidarity, but not to the extent that we could have responded better and quicker. And for the past, I mean, we've had HIV, AIDS, and we've learned from their experience on how we've pulled resources, how we've had collective action, and how we've saved lives. It wasn't just limited to a country, but it was a global response, which I think is probably not to the extent that is needed, and it's for that reason that even with the lessons that we learned from HIV, even with the lessons that we learned from Ebola, we still missed certain things. And for that reason that we say that focus on governance is to set up governance mechanisms that will ensure that they go hand in hand with these financial mechanisms and accountability mechanisms for stronger multilateral cooperation and oversight. But we need an enhanced oversight, because I think the impression that is created is that oversight is just oversight over government. But it should also be oversight over some of the non-state actors, so that when they fail to respond, there must be mechanisms by which they can be held to account. So accountability must be collective accountability. And we need to look at how we set up those governance mechanisms for this envisaged a treaty or legal instrument or convention, whatever we call it. But what the financial oversight should be, and what role can we have for these existing multilateral institutions? I mean, is it proper and fair and just to stop funding for HIV and AIDS? When people are already on treatment, we need to sustain that treatment. Is it proper to, disinvest from funding for TB? And in that case, how do we ensure that there's a question of balance? And we don't just say, okay, COVID is probably what is a priority, and we then disregard other devastating problems that we face, and they've not ended, and they're still with us. So the role of this instrument should actually ensure that we can put those protective measures in place. And coupled with this, we must look at whether we ensure that there is involvement of civil society and other non-state actors. I just want to raise a few points at national level. Firstly, preparedness was grossly underfunded. And it's something that we probably have to look at and ensure that we address these systemic problems and do it systematically. And as we push for reconfiguration of the global architecture by coming up with these governance arrangements, we must also recognize that at national level, we still have to improve coordination. We still have to ensure that equity must still be addressed between rural, urban settings, and also between poorer communities, meaning we address inequities and inequality problems nationally as we address them globally, but also catalyze the use of domestic resources. Let's push and ensure that universal health coverage become a reality, and countries put in place measures to address social protection. So the importance of domestic financing to prevent, detect, and control cannot just be emphasized, but we have to look at how best can it work. And FIFA, you're right, it starts with communities. You know, outbreaks start and end in communities. So if we do not see communities as a vital resource that we can use to build trust and invest, and also subnational systems, because people think when they've spoken to a minister in a country, that's it. We have to go further down to subnational systems and look at whether, you know, at local government level, how can we coordinate and ensure that systems work? This will help us respond early and rapidly, other than relying just on national systems. So we have to reconfigure, even at national level. Globally, I think we've all agreed that WHO need to be strengthened, but also non-state actors as key actors that can help us drive change, but also contribute to service delivery. We've seen it at local level that most countries have relied on a civil society to help deliver services. But globally, as we look at FIF, that prioritization process is going to be important. Who do we bring to the table to determine what is a priority and to determine who should be funded? Yes, you've raised these questions, but I think it should not just stop at discussions. We must set up a mechanism for that. I would like to end by saying that there are these multiple standalone pool financing. We've got Gavi, we've got CEPI, we've got Global Fund. I mean, Global Fund needs 18 billion, CEPI needs 3.5 billion, Gavi through COVAX needs 5.2. Climate change needs some financing also. So I'm asking myself, are we going to move in this track where we have all these multiple financing arrangements and without some mechanism of coordination? And what are the administrative costs for each of these? And how do we ensure that funding can be rapid and we can disperse funds early for a response, ensure that it's regular so that the delivery of public goods can be ensured, and ensure that it's flexible enough and catalytic enough to respond appropriately and support local capacity. FIFA, you're right. I mean, we have succeeded because we use community health workers, but we need also to protect the frontline workers. How do we have instances where they are not protected? So let's work together for a common cause, obviously, but as communities, ensure that we can protect citizens while working harmoniously, both at a national, regional, and global level. I thank you.
Thank you, Precious. There's so much fascinating stuff to discuss here. We've got a few minutes for questions. If there are any from the audience, it's a little dark, but yes, stick your hand in the air and we'll have a microphone coming round. If you could let us know who you are and who your question is directed to, if it's for somebody in particular. And perhaps while we're waiting for that to happen, I might ask any of the panelists if you've got any kind of comments to add now, having heard from everybody so far. Peter.
Thanks, Jessica. I guess one additional point is to discuss whether it's right to have a global initiative like the fifth, or whether it should be a series of regional initiatives, and whether that might solve some of the tensions, because organisations like the Africa Development Bank and Africa CDC may be able to hold some of the resources and make decisions that are closer to countries and choose between countries and projects without the risks of being at the global level and therefore being incentivised to focus on global issues.
Thank you. Was there a question down here? Did I see a hand in the air? Yes. Can we bring the microphone over here? Thank you.
Yeah, mine is just about vaccines inequalities, especially in Africa. There have been reports of vaccine hesitancy, and it has been an issue that has been aired out by vaccine manufacturing pharmaceutical companies. So this, and the previous speaker talked about changing the model from entirely relying on donations to relying on more sustainable business entities. So if a pharmaceutical company is to establish for example, in Africa, what plans do you have to make this more sustainable? That means that what plans do you have to make vaccine hesitancy reduce within Africa? Because it's a big challenge.
Would anybody like to?
Yeah, so with my consultancy hat on, we produced a report involving 14 LMICs, and we looked at this issue of vaccine hesitancy, and it is an issue, but I think it has been quite overblown because it really is multifactorial. In DRC, for example, the people weren't in close proximity to vaccination centers, and it was only in 2022, quite late, that international actors were like, okay, we need to make sure when the priest gives his sermon and says, look, I got vaccinated, get vaccinated, yada, yada, the vaccination center needs to be right outside the church, and it needs to be a mobile service center. In Haiti, at that time, they were undergoing, and I still think they're going through, gang violence, floods, fuel shortages, earthquake, multiple different overlapping things, and people are like going vaccine hesitancy, and you're like, okay, people are worried about their children getting kidnapped, so COVID vaccinations might, take second tier. There were so many different things that affected it, and I think, you've got tremendous vaccine hesitancy in Germany and Austria, but no one made a big deal about that. So certainly there are issues of misinformation, and we had also in DRC and Nigeria in that report, and the report is publicly available, health workers were like, my government doesn't even pay me on time, and these were clinicians and nurses. So if my government can't pay me on time, why should I trust them on this vaccine? So there are loads of sort of nuances to vaccine. I don't even like calling it that, because we don't really talk about hesitant Austrians and Germans. But there's loads of things that we need to address in addition to the supply that we need to look at in the next pandemic.
And I would say also, even beyond the issue, the exact issue around vaccines, and also coming from the United States, we have a horrific vaccine hesitancy issue within the United States, so just to name that. But it for me, points much more broadly to the failures of a system where policy and funding decisions are made from one center of power, one political, colonial perspective, without communities involved. And whether it's interest in taking up new tools or any other aspect of health, if you don't have communities involved in the design and planning, it's not going to be effective because it's not going to be adapted. And when we talk about an institution like the FIF, I am not ready, until and unless the FIF proves that it's ready to meaningfully engage communities in its funding design, both sort of internationally and at a national and local level, and really appreciated the point about subnational funding as well, and subnational strategy. It's not ready for funding. That's not a sort of to be figured out piece of the strategy. If you don't have a way to meaningfully engage communities from the start, you need to figure that out first. That doesn't come with an extra $5 billion. That comes in order to earn that money. And I'm hopeful that they can and will take that step, but I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you both. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Juan Coderque from the International Committee of the Red Cross. I'm in charge of innovative finance at the... Juan Coderque. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and I'm in charge of innovative finance. The question that I would have is on the fifth. There's hundreds of millions of people who live in areas that are not controlled by their governments, that are controlled by non-state armed groups. So is this fact included in the strategy of the fifth going forward, or will it be? And if yes, happy to discuss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question.
I'm not happy to discuss it.
Yeah, exactly. My understanding is that level of detail is put under the intermediaries, as you mentioned, Colin. So there are implementing partners that include the UN agencies that are tasked with considering at least the humanitarian angle of that. And so yes, it has been to some extent considered, but I don't know if it's considered at the level of detail that would satisfy you. That is, I think there's still those kind of pieces to be solved, but it is on their radar, and they have thought through some of the UN implementing partners that would manage that. Yeah.
And I think that taps as well into some of the coordination questions that we've heard raised during this panel. If anybody has any comments on that as well, and who should be coordinating all of these actors and initiatives, and how can they do that effectively? Yes, we've got another question over here.
My name is Lotte Thielen, Sustainalytics, ESG Research. I've been listening to this and I completely recognise the enormous funding gap there is. Just putting this 2.5 billion, I believe, that was being mentioned into perspective of a 65 billion bailout that was done by the Bank of England recently because of because of pension funds challenges, because of the gilt situation. That just seems hard to accept that the funding can't be made available for such funding gap. Has there been any success in engaging pension funds, for example, tapping into the large pots of money?
I don't know, to be honest. What you say, saying that, because that also fits in with the agenda of kind of climate change and all the different things that need to be considered for the long-term stability of the economy, and whether there can be whether things like pandemic preparedness and climate change can be mobilised from that. It's quite a broad question that targets a lot of issues. You would expect that the way that would be solved probably would be by governments on behalf of pension funds, rather than trying to get pension funds to directly contribute to something like the fifth. I'd imagine would be more effective. But it's an interesting challenge. Yeah.
Are there any other comments on that from the panel?
I would just add that, and I can't speak to UK pension funds, but fundamentally at the base of your question, I think, is that this is a political issue, and that it's not that there isn't $10 billion in the world, it's that it's not being prioritized. And so I think, and going back to the earlier comments in the interview before about there's the question of the what and how, but also the political commitment to actually doing it.
And I think the question of where's all this money going to come from is something we could probably hold a whole other session on. We are probably a little bit low on time now, so I'll have to draw questions to a close. But everybody in the room and online is invited to stay and join us for our next event, the Future of Development Finance. So if you have any further questions for the panelists, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us and giving us the benefit of your expertise. It's been really fantastic. Thank you to the audience as well for joining us, and thank you, of course, to our Changemaker partner, the Open Society Foundations, for supporting today's event. It's been great to have you all, and see you soon.